Before the city woke up, before the church bells rang, before Harlem had time to lie to itself one more time. Someone made a decision, not a crime of passion, not a drunken mistake, a calculated act meant to reorder fear. September 1946, 1 year after the world celebrated the defeat of fascism. The banners were still hanging, the uniforms were still pressed. Black soldiers had come home wearing medals from Europe, only to walk past whites-only signs on American streets. Harlem knew this contradiction well, but even Harlem believed some lines no longer existed. They were wrong. The Ku Klux Klan didn't sneak into Harlem. They announced themselves. They chose Marcus Garvey Park on purpose, not an alley, not a basement, a park named after black liberation, visible from 3 streets used by churchgoers, mothers, children. This wasn't murder. This was theater. The Klan understood symbolism. They always had. Ropes weren't just tools. They were language. Trees weren't just trees. They were billboards. And that morning, Harlem woke up to a sentence written in fiber and flesh. The body hung low enough to be unmistakable, high enough to force witnesses to look up. A young black man, barely out of boyhood. Columbia University sweatshirt, clean, pressed, hopeful, one shoe missing, torn away during a struggle that never made the papers. His hands told the truth before anyone else could lie about it. Those were not the hands of a man who chose to die. Those were the hands of someone who fought, who believed, even in the final seconds, that the world might still intervene. It didn't. Pinned to his chest was the message: crude, misspelled, intentional. The Klan didn't care about grammar. They cared about memory. They wanted Harlem to remember that education wouldn't save you, that ambition wouldn't save you, that the North was only polite, not safe. The police arrived quietly. They moved efficiently. And then they did what they had been trained to do when justice became inconvenient. They simplified. Suicide. That word didn't just erase a murder, it erased a future, because the boy wasn't a nobody. He was Thomas Johnson, 19 years old, pre-law, first in his family to attend an Ivy League university, and most importantly, he was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's nephew. The Klan knew that name. They didn't ignore it. They tested it. This was not an attack on a family. This was a probe, a challenge, a message written in blood that said, "You don't control this city. We do." What the Klan didn't understand, what history only whispers about now, is that Bumpy Johnson didn't rule Harlem through noise or chaos. He ruled it through order. And order, when violated, demands correction. When Bumpy Johnson received the news, he didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He didn't threaten the heavens. He went quiet. In Harlem, that silence was more terrifying than gunfire. Because silence meant the board had been studied, the pieces named, the end already imagined. The Klan believed the police would protect them, that the courts would stall. That time would dull the outrage. They didn't realize they had stepped into a city that kept its own books and balanced them without witnesses. History calls what followed a rumor, a legend, an exaggeration passed down in barbershops and back rooms. But legends don't erase organizations. Legends don't leave warehouses empty. Legends don't make men flee cities overnight. Something else happened in Harlem after that rope creaked in the morning wind. Something deliberate, something patient, something final. History says it was a suicide. The streets say it was the opening move in 7 days of smoke. And if you want the truth the law buried, if you want the shadow history they never taught, subscribe now. By the time the city pretended to move on, Bumpy Johnson had already stopped living in the present. Grief did not slow him. Anger did not blind him. It clarified him. The men who survived Harlem learned early that Bumpy Johnson never reacted. He absorbed. Absorption was his gift. Silence was his weapon. While the newspapers printed a single word, suicide, Bumpy read the city the way a coroner reads a body. He didn't need confessions, he didn't need paperwork, he needed patterns, and Harlem was nothing but patterns. He returned to the park when the uniforms were gone. That mattered. Police looked for closure. Bumpy looked for residue. He saw what authority always missed: 5 cigarette butts pressed into the dirt, not scattered, grouped, shoe impressions overlapping, men standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting. The bark of the oak scraped raw where rope had rubbed under weight. This wasn't chaos. It was rehearsal. Someone had planned this like a job. Bumpy didn't touch anything. He didn't need souvenirs. He memorized. Because memory, unlike evidence, can't be confiscated. Every city has citizens who are invisible by design. Men the system steps over. Men who see everything because no one thinks they're watching. Bumpy understood their value. He didn't threaten them, didn't interrogate. He simply acknowledged them. And acknowledgement in a city that ignores you opens mouths faster than fear ever could. What Bumpy gathered wasn't testimony. It was confirmation. 5 white men, early arrival, no hoods, too confident to hide. Confidence like that only comes from belief. Belief that the system will protect you. Belief that the ground beneath your feet isn't hostile. They had chosen wrong ground. Bumpy didn't storm bars or flip tables. He didn't ask questions where questions were dangerous. He relied on gravity. Debts pulled answers toward him. Bartenders remember everything, not because they want to, but because alcohol loosens truth. What Bumpy learned came in fragments at first, names half-spoken, routines hinted at, meetings described as clubs. But fragments form pictures when you know where to look. By nightfall, the picture sharpened. 5 men, working class, married, some, respected by neighbors who didn't know what they did after dark. They weren't monsters. That was the most dangerous part. They were mechanics, factory hands, men who shook hands on Sunday and tightened ropes before sunrise. Bumpy didn't rush the names. He tested them. Cross-referenced taverns with factories, factories with shift changes with alibis that lined up too perfectly. Perfect alibis are fingerprints. When the final confirmation came, it didn't arrive loudly. No revelation, no dramatic moment, just certainty. 5 men had walked into Harlem believing themselves untouchable. They had been wrong about the city, and catastrophically wrong about the man who ruled its shadows. This was the moment everything changed, not when the rope was tied, not when the body was found, but when grief finished transforming into intention. From this point forward, nothing would be reactive. There would be no chaos, no wasted motion, only dismantling. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't believe in spectacle. He believed in sequence. The Klan thought they had sent a message. What they didn't realize, what history almost lost, was that they had just volunteered to become an example. And examples, when done correctly, travel faster than rumors. What came next wouldn't feel like revenge. It would feel like inevitability. Because when a man like Bumpy Johnson decides to move, the city doesn't brace for impact. It holds its breath. The mistake most men make about violence is believing it begins with blood. Bumpy Johnson knew better. Violence begins with certainty. The moment a man realizes the world he trusted has quietly turned against him. That was the real weapon, and on the first night, Bumpy used it sparingly. The first man wasn't chosen because he was the worst. He was chosen because he was visible. The Klan believed in hierarchy. So did Bumpy. The first correction always happens at the top. What happened in that garage was later called an accident, a tragic misunderstanding involving rope, height, and poor footing. But accidents don't leave patterns. By sunrise, whispers had already started. Not in Harlem, in their neighborhoods. The remaining 4 men didn't say his name out loud, didn't have to. They saw the symmetry. They felt the implication. Someone knew, someone had been watching, and whoever it was didn't rush. Confidence evaporates quietly. The second and third men didn't sleep well, didn't laugh the same, didn't stay long at work. They checked locks twice, windows 3 times. They told themselves the first death meant nothing. But men who truly believe that don't start jumping at shadows. What Bumpy understood, and the Klan never had, was that fear doesn't need to kill you to ruin your life. Fire has always been their language. So fire spoke back. When the garage burned, the flames didn't discriminate. They erased safety. They erased pride. They erased the illusion of control. Survival in this case wasn't mercy. It was education. Because a man who lives in constant pain becomes a billboard for consequences. The third target ran. That mattered. Running meant understanding. But Bumpy never chased. He paced. The woods became a classroom. Silence became instruction. No blows were struck, no blood spilled, and yet the damage was irreversible. When they found him days later, his body was intact. His mind was not. That was deliberate, because insanity spreads faster than funerals. By now, the remaining men weren't asking if something was happening. They were asking when. Families were moved, routines abandoned, homes left behind like shedding skin. Bumpy allowed this. He wanted displacement, because a man without a home is already halfway defeated. Fire returned, not to flesh, but to memory. This was the lesson. You don't need to die to lose everything. One man cracked, not because he was weak, but because certainty had finally reached him. Confession isn't born from guilt, it's born from inevitability. Bumpy didn't need him dead, he needed him useful. And usefulness under pressure creates leverage. The message was simple: leave, disappear, or stay and become proof. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a conclusion. No gunfire, no speeches, just logistics. Doors secured, exits accounted for, timing precise. Fire rose the way it always does, hungry, honest, irreversible. Inside, men realized too late that arrogance burns faster than gasoline. Outside, Harlem slept, because terror doesn't announce its end, it simply stops showing up. By morning, the city would call it an accident. And for once, the word fit. What mattered wasn't how many died. What mattered was who remained, and who never came back. The Klan didn't retreat, they evaporated. And in Harlem, silence returned. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of balance restored. After the smoke cleared, something unusual happened. Nothing. No reprisals, no counterattacks, no follow-up messages nailed to trees or scrawled on walls. The city exhaled and realized it could breathe again. The Klan didn't issue statements, didn't threaten revenge, didn't regroup. They vanished the way weak men always do when certainty replaces fear, quietly and without witnesses. The warehouses went dark. The taverns went quiet. The meetings stopped happening, not postponed, not relocated, erased. The official records were thin, accidents, unrelated incidents, no pattern worth pursuing. That was the brilliance of it. Bumpy Johnson didn't create a scandal. He created plausibility. Because justice that announces itself invites correction. Justice that blends into paperwork becomes permanent. The law returned to its routine. But Harlem did not forget. In barbershops, the story wasn't told loudly. In churches, it wasn't preached. It was understood. What lingered wasn't the violence. It was the absence of it. Years passed. New gangs rose. New hustlers tested boundaries. But something fundamental had shifted. Harlem was no longer considered accessible territory for terror. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson never claimed credit. He didn't need to. Power that explains itself isn't power. It's insecurity. Those who needed to know already did. Those who didn't were safer not knowing. The boy at the center of it all never became a lawyer, never stood in a courtroom, never argued before a judge. But his death rewrote a rule that had stood unchallenged for generations. That rule said terror could move freely as long as it wore the right skin. After those 7 days, that rule no longer applied in Harlem. Justice didn't come wearing a robe. It didn't arrive on letterhead. It didn't ask permission. It came the only way it ever has when systems collapse, through consequence. This is why the story survived. Not because it was violent, but because it worked. Because for the rest of the 1940s, the 1950s, and well into the 1960s, there were no ropes in Harlem parks, no notes nailed to black bodies, no men in hoods testing boundaries, not once. History teaches laws, legend teaches limits, and this legend carried a message that traveled farther than fear ever could. When the system refuses to protect its children, someone else will. And when that happens, terror learns restraint. This wasn't revenge, it was correction. And correction, when done properly, doesn't need repeating. Harlem remembered, and those who needed the lesson never forgot it. Years later, when reporters asked why certain things never happened again in Harlem, the answers were never written down. There were no plaques, no trials, no official acknowledgments, only absence. Absence of hoods, absence of ropes, absence of men who believed terror could walk north without consequence. That kind of absence doesn't come from luck. It comes from memory. In Harlem, the story wasn't told as a fairy tale. It was told as a boundary, not with dates, not with names, just with a look that said, "Don't test what's already been proven." Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson lived long enough to see laws change on paper. He also lived long enough to know paper doesn't stop ropes. What stops ropes is certainty, the kind that doesn't need speeches, the kind that doesn't repeat itself. The boy who wanted to be a lawyer never stood before a judge, but his death closed a courtroom the system had left open for generations, and it stayed closed. 7 days, 12 lives undone, one message that outlived all of them. Harlem was not conquered. Harlem was answered, and after that, the city slept easier, not because it believed in the law, but because it remembered what happens when the law refuses to act and someone else does. If this story made you question where justice ends and necessity begins, if you want the histories that never made the textbooks, subscribe. We don't glorify violence. We document what happens when systems fail and communities are forced to protect themselves. Drop a comment. Was this justice or inevitability? Turn on notifications. These are Harlem's secrets, and some of them were paid for in smoke. No court transcript ever recorded what happened in those 7 days. No judge weighed evidence. No jury debated intent. And that omission wasn't an accident, because to record it would have meant admitting the truth, that the system didn't miss the crime. It avoided it. When a lynching is filed as a suicide, the law makes a choice. When that choice is made, consequences don't disappear. They relocate. They move to places without letterhead. They move to men who understand balance. What followed wasn't chaos. It was calibration. Violence didn't increase in Harlem after 1946. It decreased because terror feeds on permission. And permission had been revoked. The most revealing detail is the quiet one. After those 7 days, there were no copycats, no imitators seeking notoriety, no gangs trying to wear the legend. Because legends that work don't invite competition. They impose limits. Bumpy Johnson was never trying to rule the city. He was trying to stabilize it. Grandmasters don't seek applause. They seek positions where no move hurts them. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, the board had already been cleared. This is why the story survives, not as a headline, but as a warning. Not because it's bloody, but because it's precise. because it explains something history prefers not to admit. Sometimes justice isn't delayed, it's redirected. And when it returns, it doesn't ask for recognition. The oak tree still stands. People pass beneath it every day without knowing what once hung there, or what answered back. That's how you know the message worked. If you're here, for the stories that power tried to erase, for the truths that only survive in shadows, subscribe. This channel doesn't chase myths, it preserves boundaries. And some boundaries were written not in law, but in smoke. There are stories history refuses to finish, not because they're incomplete, but because completing them would require admitting something uncomfortable. After 1946, something invisible settled over Harlem. Not fear, not silence, a line no one crossed. The newspapers never wrote about it. The police never acknowledged it. The courts never tested it, but everyone felt it. That line said, "This neighborhood is not defenseless. This community is not alone. This history will answer back." Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson didn't leave behind monuments. He left behind conditions. Conditions where terror calculated twice, where hatred hesitated, where some men decided the risk wasn't worth the certainty. And the boy at the center of it all, the one the system called a suicide, became something far more permanent than a victim. He became a boundary. This is why the story never dies, not because it's sensational, but because it explains why certain things didn't happen afterward. History tells you what occurred. Shadow history tells you what stopped. If you're here for the truths that never made the record, for the stories power hoped would fade, subscribe. These aren't legends. They're reminders. And some reminders were written not in ink, but in smoke.